A woman was preparing for the meal when she heard strange noises coming from the sink. When her husband Dashan returned home, he asked why no meal had been prepared, and the woman then told him about the eerie sounds. After checking, Dashan couldn't hear anything unusual himself, but his wife insisted that she had heard voices that even said they were going to kill her. Since their neighbor, Xiaode, was busy renovating his house, Dashan assumed the noise must be coming from there and told his wife not to worry too much. Later that night, the woman got up to use the bathroom. Not long after she left, Dashan heard knocking sounds coming from next door. Since it was 5 in the morning, Dashan became very angry and warned the neighbor to stop making noise, but as soon as he lay down, the sound returned. Seeing that his warning had no effect, Dashan went over to investigate. Strangely, every time he rang the doorbell, someone answered, but no one spoke. With no other recourse, Dashan had to return home. Once back, he discovered that the knocking was coming from the bathroom. Only then did he realize he had wrongly accused his neighbor. When he went in to check, he was shocked to see his wife bouncing around mid-air, and no matter how he tried to stop her, she continued to bounce. 3 elderly individuals approached Dashan. The one speaking was forensic pathologist Xiao Luo, and beside him were 2 professors who specialized in paranormal phenomena. They believed Dashan was not the one who had killed his wife. Instead, they had come to ask if any strange events had happened recently. After a moment's thought, Dashan told them that his neighbor Xiaode had been acting oddly lately because he always made strange noises in the middle of the night. At the mention of the name Xiaode, the professor immediately grew nervous. It turned out that this Xiaode had previously sought their help. He said that he too had encountered some bizarre occurrences. A week earlier, the scene showed Xiaode, who, believing his house was haunted for several months, had called Professor Xiao Hua for help. However, since the professor was not available at the time, an assistant answered the phone and told Xiaode to call back the next day. Xiaode always had the uneasy feeling that something was under his bed, even though whenever he looked, nothing was there. This persistent feeling had caused him long bouts of insomnia, forcing him to take sleeping pills every night. Just as he finally fell asleep one night, his bed began to move in a strange way. He looked under the bed again but still saw nothing. No sooner had he lain down than a monster appeared. At that very moment, the table lamp went out. Xiaode pressed the switch repeatedly to no avail, then remembered the outlet under the bed. As soon as he plugged something in, a monster burst out of the house. Terrified, Xiaode could do nothing but pray under his blanket. The next day, Xiaode woke up to find his house in utter chaos. He called Professor Xiaohua again, saying that the monster was no longer merely knocking or moving objects, it had appeared in person. Xiaode even claimed he had seen it with his own eyes the previous night, but the assistant still refused to help him. After returning home, Xiaode stared blankly at his house. At that moment, Dashan arrived. With his wife still unharmed, Dashan asked Xiaode why he kept knocking on walls. Xiaode lied, claiming that he was busy renovating his house. That same evening, since the assistant had been demanding evidence, Xiaode, fed up, bought a video camera. He set it up on a cabinet to record what might happen after he fell asleep. Sure enough, as Xiaode slept soundly, a strange noise woke him. Looking down, he discovered that the video camera had fallen. At that moment, the shadow of a monster appeared by the window. When Xiaode switched on the light, the shadow vanished. Picking up the camera, he rewound the footage and saw that, after he had fallen asleep, a monster had been eerily watching him. And then, the monster had hidden inside his wardrobe. In its sudden rush, the monster knocked the camera to the floor. Xiaode stared at the wardrobe in disbelief. Terrified, Xiaode grabbed his gun and walked toward the cabinet. However, when he opened it, he found nothing inside but some of his clothes. Then he picked up the video camera again and rewound the footage further, discovering that the monster had come out from beneath the bed. Suddenly, the cabinet door opened on its own, revealing the monster inside. Xiaode also caught sight of the creature in the glint of reflected light. Just as he was about to pick up his gun, the monster beat him to it. The next day, a child accidentally kicked a ball into Xiaode's house. The child only got a bit of water, but Xiaode was so angry he told the child to leave immediately. Terrified, the child backed away repeatedly when suddenly a bus appeared and ran over the little boy, killing him instantly. Dashan hurried out to investigate. He immediately recognized the child as the son of his neighbor Xiao Ai. Soon after, the police arrived. After handling the accident, they began cleaning up the scene, and even the snow on the ground was sucked down into the sewer. They held a funeral for the little boy. Dashan was puzzled that he hadn't seen his neighbor Xiaode for many days. Xiaole received a phone call from the police. The police chief explained that they'd encountered a supernatural incident and needed Xiaolo's assistance in the investigation. When Xiaolo arrived, the caller turned out to be Xiao Ai. Entering the kitchen, they were stunned to see the deceased child sitting at the dining table. Apparently, just moments earlier, while Xiao Ai was smoking, she had heard strange noises outside. When she went to check, she saw many footprints and even the shadow of a child outside the door. In the midst of their conversation, the milk on the table suddenly spilled over. Staring at the corpse in disbelief, Xiao Luo suggested that they quickly rebury the body and that they must not report the matter to their superiors because the police chief was Xiao Ai's ex-boyfriend. If it became known that Xiao Ai had exhumed the corpse, people would think she was mentally ill and she might even go to jail. To avoid this, Xiaolo instructed the officers to publicly claim it was merely post-mortem embryonic material. He even suggested that Xiaoai be injected with some anesthetic, reasoning that a mother would certainly never allow anyone to take her child away. After leaving the house, Xiaolo noticed a woman taking photographs across the street. She looked familiar to him, so he went over to inquire. In their conversation, he learned that the woman was none other than Professor Xiaohua, the expert on paranormal phenomena. Xiaolo asked her what she was doing there, and she explained that she had received a plea for help from Xiaodi and had come to investigate the supernatural incident. Strangely, when she had rung the doorbell at Xiaodi's place, someone answered, but no one spoke. Hearing how coincidental that was, Xiaolo invited the professor to join him in the investigation. Xiaolo first showed her the corpse, and then the two moved into the living room to discuss the matter. Xiaolo, who had worked as a forensic pathologist for 15 years, had encountered many supernatural events. Yet he believed that even if these events were real, they should be handled quietly. Professor Xiaohua fully agreed with him. At that moment, a child jumped in from outside to retrieve his toy and saw the corpse. As the child became transfixed by the corpse, meanwhile, Xiao Luo, upon viewing the footage, thought it was all a coincidence, but the Professor Xiaohua was convinced that the two supernatural incidents were connected. Suddenly, the sound of a boy's scream came out. Xiaolo went over and found that the door was open. He immediately realized someone had entered. To be on the safe side, they placed the corpse into a refrigerator, but they had no idea that their actions were being recorded by the little boy. Shortly afterwards, Xiaolo contacted the police chief. The two decided to dispose of the corpse quickly while the child's mother was asleep. Just as they were about to move it, the refrigerator shuddered mysteriously. Seeing this, Professor Xiaohua proposed a cooperation with the police chief. Soon, matters got back on track. They told Dashan that they believed the three cases were linked in some way. Although they had received police approval, they still needed Dashan to provide an authorization letter. Only with this could they enter the house for an investigation. Dashan signed the letter, and the group began their investigation. The officers, accompanied by Professor Xiaoye, went to Xiaodei's house. Forensic pathologist Xiao Lo went to the house of the deceased boy. Professor Xiaohua set up various instruments to detect any unusual phenomena. Because Xiaodei's house was dark, the police chief called Professor Xiaohua to ask if she wanted the power turned back on. The professor outright refused, explaining that without light, the monsters would appear even more easily. When the police chief and his team entered the kitchen, they noticed that some pieces of tableware were clinging to the cabinet. Just as the professor reached out to touch one, a piece of tableware suddenly impaled his palm. As the police chief moved over to help, the professor made a new discovery. He said that something was inside the cabinet and that it was continuously drawing his blood. The police chief immediately grabbed his gun while the professor opened the cabinet door. But as soon as they opened it, the monster moved. The professor warned the police chief not to shoot, then drawing a fruit knife himself. Immediately after, the police chief escorted him to a safe area. While the professor was tending to his wound, the police chief noticed that objects in the house were moving on their own. The professor then asked him to clean up a bit. The scene then shifted to Xiao Lo, who received a call from the police chief. The chief said he wanted to leave the area because he had seen things he couldn't explain and suffering from heart disease. He couldn't afford to be frightened. As they talked, Xiao Luo suddenly spotted a figure standing by a window. Then, without warning, the monster charged over and the sound on Xiao Luo's phone abruptly cut off. Professor Xiaohua noticed a crack appear in the wall. The scene shifted back to the police chief, who approached the professor and said he was leaving. But the professor had made a new discovery under the bed, and from that angle nothing was visible. However, when they viewed it from another angle, to their shock, the space was filled with monsters. The professor explained that in the same time and space, darkness and light coexist. Terrified by what he saw, the police chief hurriedly left the house, but after a moment's thought, he decided to call Xiaolo and leave together. The police chief arrived at the little boy's house and called out for Xiao Luo, but received no answer. Suddenly, when he turned around, he saw a bloody handprint on the cabinet. When he opened the cabinet, he found only some plates and cups inside. Then he recalled the professor's words. From a different angle, one sees different things. As he moved to the side of the cabinet, a knocking sound emerged from within. He pried the cabinet open and was instantly stunned to find that inside was none other than Xiao Luo, who was already dead. The scene shifted to Professor Xiaohua. Peering into a crack in the wall, she discovered Xiaode, who had been missing for so long. At that moment, the police chief arrived and informed her that Xiao Luo is dead. The professor advised the police chief not to believe everything, and it was all just supernatural phenomena. Then Professor Xiaohua contacted Professor Xiaoye. He believed that the situation had spiraled out of control and that the investigation must be stopped immediately. The police chief couldn't understand the situation. Professor Xiaohua then explained, "These monsters spread through water. It was the water from Xiaode's house that the child had drunk, which led to the car accident. Later, when the police were cleaning up the scene, that water had been flushed into Dashan's sewer, so that was why Dashan's wife had heard those strange sounds while cooking." While the two were talking, a hand suddenly emerged from the crack in the wall and twisted the professor's neck until it broke. Witnessing everything, the police chief was so terrified that he suffered a heart attack. The scene then shifted to Professor Xiao Ye, who, while watching the video camera, noticed that the cabinet behind him had opened by itself. When the police chief woke up, he found that the furniture in the house was moving on its own. At that moment, Xiao Ai came over. The police chief pleaded with Xiao Ai to help him, but Xiao Ai resented him for trying to take her child away. Through the video of the child, Xiao Ai saw that the police chief had hidden the corpse in the refrigerator. After much pleading from the police chief, Xiao Ai's heart softened. Just as the police chief was about to get into her car, he saw the child's corpse and backed up and then found another car, planning to go to the hospital alone. But then Professor Xiaohua ran out of the house with broken neck, which completely frightened the police chief. He slammed on the accelerator. However, after driving a short distance, the police chief stopped by the roadside and picked up his walkie-talkie to call the police station. The officers at the police station believed that the police chief was still investigating those houses and had already reached the scene, even though they couldn't see his car. Upon hearing this, the police chief quickly grabbed his walkie-talkie and ordered them to leave the area immediately. The officers reported that they had seen Xiaolo standing motionless in front of the house, but the police chief told them not to worry and once again ordered them to leave the area. After some thought, the police chief decided to return. When he arrived back at the house, he went straight to the trunk and pulled out 2 buckets of gasoline. As soon as he stepped into the living room, he discovered that Xiao Ai had hung herself. Although the police chief was deeply saddened, he still poured the gasoline throughout the area. Just as he was about to light a match, it failed to ignite. When he turned around, he discovered that Xiaolo was standing nearby, continuously blowing on it. Terrified, the police chief recoiled, then picked up his handgun and fired into the gasoline until the house was set ablaze. The scene then shifted to 5 years later. 3 people came looking for Dashan. They asked if he remembered forensic pathologist Xiao Luo and the 2 professors. Dashan nodded, saying he did know them. Then they produced a photograph of the police chief and explained that a police officer had witnessed the entire process of the police chief burning down the house, with people still inside at the time, and that the police chief is now a fugitive. While the group was talking, Dashan mentioned that he had seen someone, but when the others turned around, there was nothing. Then Dashan picked up a photograph of that person. It turned out to be Professor Xiao Ye. Dashan even pointed to the doorway. Just as the group turned around again, a stool beside them shuddered, and finally, it flew straight toward them.